The 1980s, such a cool and iconic decade, am I right? The hair, the music, the bright colors. There's a lot of nostalgia around the 1980s. But you know what there isn't nostalgia for from the 80s? That 18% interest rate. Have you heard about that? I bet you have if you're trying to buy a house. Nowadays, you can't swing a cat without hitting a realtor or a lender telling you that the 7% interest rate is nothing. It's nothing compared to what we had in the 80s. It was 18% in the 80s. I don't understand what your problem is. I don't understand why you can't afford a house. It's so much better now than it was then. Have you heard this? I bet you have. And there's reasons why you hear it, because the news is telling us this. Check this out. But don't feel bad. There's reasons why you're still struggling. And in this video, we're going to get into why, even though the 18% interest rate was worse than it is today, it's still harder to buy a home now than it was in the 1980s. Welcome to my channel. My name is Krista Tarrans, and I'm a realtor in Central Florida. And I think I might be guilty of telling people that, you know, the 7% is bad, but it's not. It's been worse. And I'm sorry for that. When I think about the 80s, obviously I was not a home buyer yet, and my first-time home buyers weren't even alive in the 80s. But when I think about the 80s, I don't remember, and this is my personal experience, this is just what I recall, I don't remember having a lot of friends whose parents were renters. I can't remember anybody, really. It seemed everybody owned a home. So homeownership was still within reach for a lot of people. Nowadays, though, in a recent poll, 61% of renters said that they didn't think they would ever be able to afford a home. And 76% of people said that now is a really bad time to buy a house. So what's changed? What's different about the 80s versus now that's keeping people from being able to buy a home when arguably it was so much worse then? The situation was arguably worse in the 1980s, but let's take a look at some numbers to see if we can figure out why people are shying away from the American dream of homeownership. Before we begin, however, I want to point out that I pulled these numbers together from some different sources, and there were a lot of different numbers out there. There's a lot of different statistics for how much people earned and how much homes cost. I tried to find kind of the middle of everything because there's a wide range, and I don't have a time machine to jump back and poll people to figure out how much their house cost and what their average wage was in these years, but I did my best. So let's start out in 1970. Let's look at the average home buyer in 1970. So the average yearly wage was $9,870. The average home price was about $17,000. Don't we wish we could all just jump back to 1970? Most people rented for 2.6 years before buying, and the average home buyer age was about 30. In 1970, you could buy a home for about 1.72 times your annual single income salary. Homeownership was in pretty easy reach. It didn't really make that much sense to rent. HOAs weren't really common yet, so you didn't have that little additional financial strain. And property taxes were low to incentivize homeownership. Now let's jump to the 1980s, the focus of this video. Things got a little rough in the 80s. The median income was about $21,000, and the average home price in just 10 years had jumped to $47,200, which puts us at 2.25 times the median income. Your average home buyer was still around 30 years, but they were renting for a bit longer, about 5 years. So not only did interest rates jump up to 18% at the peak of the decade, but housing had jumped to 3.7 times more than annual wages. And check out this news clip from 1982. Tell me this doesn't sound familiar.
It's no secret that the real estate industry has been one of the big losers in these recessionary times. Sales of new and old homes are off 50% from the peak in 1978. The cause for all this, well, it's well known: high interest rates. And the blame realtors say should be laid on the lap of Congress. Already 18 days overdue on a budget resolution for next year, the representatives are locked in a bitter battle over how much more the government will spend over what it takes in.
The budget deficit must be cut under $100 billion and must be brought into balance within 3 to 4 years.
Now, a healthy price to income ratio is 2.6. That means it would take 2.6 years of median income to purchase the median home. But nationwide, that price to income ratio hasn't been 2.6 since the 1990s. So let's skip ahead to today. This year, the average home buyer is now 42 years old. The average wage is about $78,000 and the median home price is $420,000. The average first-time home buyer in 2024 is 35 years old. Do you see why people are older now? Because home prices are a whopping 5.4 times more than the average income. Let's make this easier to compare throughout the decades by taking a look at the numbers in today's, adjusted for inflation value. In 1970, the average salary of $9,870 in today's money is $80,307. That $17,000 house in 1970, adjusted for inflation, is about $138,000. 1980's $21,000 in today's money is $84,000. That $47,200 house is about $180,000. Today's median income, from 2022 at least, $75,000, something like that, and the median home price is about $380,000. So that's from 2022. I've seen that figure as high as $420,000. So this lays it out pretty clearly, though. But if we look at monthly payments using these numbers, that 1980s home, let's say it was $50,000, right? Even with an 18% interest rate, would cost you about $2,300 per month. And that would require about $36,000 as a down payment if you wanted to put down 20%. So let's talk about the $420,000 house that we find today. That will require you to save up about $84,000 if you want to put down 20%. And your monthly payment is going to come out to about $2,700 per month, and that's with a pretty conservative number for tax and insurance. But that 20% down is definitely going to be difficult when it's now equaling over a year's wage. So if you're struggling to buy a home right now and your parents or your grandparents or older friends are wondering why you can't manage it when it was so much worse in the 80s, this will help you explain it to them. Even though our 1980s home buyers went through this period of absolutely absurd interest rates to try to curb inflation, it was still more affordable to buy a home in the 80s than it is right now. Another thing to keep in mind is that your interest rate can be renegotiated later on through refinancing. But that purchase price, you're stuck with that. Now, experts are a bit more optimistic about those interest rates coming down at least a little bit in the coming months or year as we curb inflation a bit. We'll see how that plays out this year and the end of the year. But I don't know of anyone who is thinking that interest rates are going to go back down into the 3s like they were a few years ago. But hopefully we'll see the 5s again. If you were a homeowner in the 1980s, I'd love to hear your experience. Do you think it was more affordable then, even with that interest rate? Did you buy a home in the 80s? Did you refinance? I'd love to hear what you experienced if you went through that. One thing's for sure, it's interesting times we live in. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.